Los Angeles, January 1966. Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale were sitting in the same room. Management wasn't there yet. Just the two of them. And a plan. The plan was simple. They would negotiate together. They would sign together or refuse together. If both refused, the Dodgers' rotation would collapse. Because Koufax and Drysdale were the two best pitchers in baseball that year. On the same team. At the same time. Management knew it. Koufax and Drysdale knew it. And that knowledge, that specific, undeniable, mathematically provable knowledge, produced the most audacious negotiation in the history of professional baseball. Before that January meeting ended, two men had decided to do something no players had ever done. To use their combined value as a single weapon. To walk in together, demand together, and walk out together regardless of the answer. The Dodgers had no idea what was about to happen to them. Nobody did. What happened next changed baseball forever. To understand what Koufax and Drysdale attempted, you need to understand what each of them was individually in 1966. Not together, individually. Because the power of the plan came from the fact that either one of them, alone, was already a problem that the Dodgers could not solve by simply replacing him. Sandy Koufax was 29 years old, and the most dominant pitcher in the history of the Los Angeles Dodgers. In 1965, he had won 26 games, had struck out 382 batters, a record, had thrown a perfect game, had won the Cy Young Award, had been the central reason the Dodgers had won the World Series. He threw a curveball that hitters described in terms that sounded like they were describing weather phenomena, something that arrived looking like one thing and became another thing entirely before it reached the plate. His fastball was not the fastest in baseball, but it worked with his curveball in a combination that created a problem without a solution. Hitters who sat on the fastball couldn't handle the curve. Hitters who adjusted for the curve couldn't catch the fastball. Koufax had figured out something that most pitchers spend entire careers searching for and never find. He was also unknown to the public and known very quietly within the Dodgers organization, pitching through arthritis in his left elbow that was getting worse every season. Every start cost him something that could not be fully recovered. He was throwing on borrowed time. He knew it, and he was going to get paid for what remained. Don Drysdale was 29 years old, and the second best pitcher in baseball that year, which sounds like a diminishment until you understand what second best meant, when the first best was Sandy Koufax. Drysdale was 6 feet 5 inches tall, and threw from a sidearm angle that made right-handed batters feel like the ball was being thrown at their heads before it broke over the plate. He had won 23 games in 1962, had struck out 200 or more batters in multiple seasons, had been selected to multiple All-Star games, had a reputation among hitters that went beyond statistics into something more personal. Drysdale threw inside, deliberately, aggressively, as a statement of territorial ownership that he made at the beginning of every at-bat against every hitter regardless of reputation or history. He had hit more batters than almost any pitcher of his era. Not because he was wild, because he was precise in a direction that batters found uncomfortable. He was, in the language of baseball, a competitor who made the inside corner his, and dared you to dispute the claim. Hitters did not love facing Drysdale. They feared him in the specific way you fear someone who has made it clear that your comfort is not their concern. Together with Koufax, he formed a 1-2 rotation that no team in baseball could match. The Dodgers knew what they had. They were about to find out what it cost. The salary structure of baseball in 1966 was a system built entirely to benefit ownership. The reserve clause bound players to their teams indefinitely. A player could not negotiate with any other team, could not test his value on an open market, could not use competitive interest from other organizations as leverage. He could negotiate with his team, accept whatever the team offered, or retire. Those were the options. In practice, this meant that teams set salaries at whatever level they chose, and players accepted them because the alternative, holding out, refusing to sign, sitting out, carried enormous risk and limited reward. A player who held out damaged his relationship with management, missed spring training, fell behind in preparation, and eventually signed anyway because the team simply waited him out. The system was designed to make individual resistance futile. What Koufax and Drysdale understood, sitting in that Los Angeles room in January 1966, was that individual resistance was futile. Combined resistance was something else entirely. Because the Dodgers could replace one unhappy pitcher, they could not replace both of their starting pitchers simultaneously without destroying their season before it began. The number they decided on was $1 million. Split between them, $500,000 each. Over 3 years. In 1966, the highest salary in baseball was approximately $130,000 per year. What Koufax and Drysdale were asking for was roughly 4 times the highest salary in the sport, for each of them, guaranteed over 3 years. The number was not chosen arbitrarily. It was chosen because it was large enough to be serious, large enough that even if management negotiated them down significantly, the final number would still represent a dramatic increase over what either man was currently making. It was also chosen because announcing a number that large immediately established the terms of the conversation. You don't negotiate from $130,000 to $500,000. You start somewhere that forces the other side to come to you. They hired a lawyer. His name was J. William Hayes. Hiring a lawyer to negotiate a baseball contract was itself unusual in 1966. Players didn't do that. Players met with management, heard the offer, argued a little, and signed. Bringing a lawyer communicated that this negotiation was not going to follow the usual script. The Dodgers understood the message. They did not like it. Spring training arrived in February. Koufax and Drysdale did not. They stayed in Los Angeles. Hayes communicated with management. Management communicated their position, which was that $1 million was not a number they were going to discuss seriously. Koufax and Drysdale communicated their position, which was that they were prepared to miss as much of the season as necessary. The Dodgers, privately panicking but publicly composed, said they were confident the matter would be resolved. Privately, they were doing the math that anyone with access to the previous season's statistics could do. The Dodgers without Koufax and Drysdale were not a World Series team, were not a pennant contender, were a team with a good lineup and a pitching staff that had been built around 2 anchors who were currently refusing to anchor anything. The pressure was entirely on management. Koufax and Drysdale had no games to lose. They had salaries to gain. Management had a season that was already scheduled and a fan base that expected competition. Every day of spring training that passed without resolution was a day closer to the regular season beginning, without the 2 best pitchers in the National League. Subscribe right now if you've ever watched 2 people refuse to blink. Hit like if you think players deserve to be paid what they're worth. And drop a comment. Did Koufax and Drysdale deserve the money? Because what happened when the Dodgers finally responded changed everything. The negotiation stretched through February and into March. The public followed it with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Players negotiating collectively was not something baseball had seen. The instinct of the era, shaped by decades of the reserve clause and its accompanying power structure, was to view players who held out as selfish or ungrateful. But Koufax and Drysdale were not easy to dismiss as selfish or ungrateful. They were the 2 best pitchers in baseball. They were asking to be paid as the 2 best pitchers in baseball. The argument against them required accepting that players had no right to the market value of their own performance, which was an argument that sounded less reasonable the more you examined it. The press was divided. Some columnists supported the players. Some supported management. All of them were writing about it constantly, which meant the story stayed alive, and the pressure on the Dodgers accumulated daily. In late March, the Dodgers blinked. Not entirely. The final numbers were not $1 million. Koufax signed for $330,000 per season. Drysdale signed for $110,000. Together, over the 1-year contracts they ultimately accepted rather than the 3-year deal they had sought, the total was significantly less than their original demand. Management called it a victory. Technically it was. The number was lower than asked. The 3-year guarantee was not achieved. The lawyer was paid and sent home, and baseball returned to its normal rhythms. But something had changed. Something that the numbers alone didn't capture. 2 players had negotiated jointly, had hired representation, had used their combined value as leverage, had forced a team to respond to a united position rather than managing 2 individual negotiations separately, had demonstrated that the system could be pushed, that the structure of baseball salary negotiation, presented for decades as immovable, was not immovable. It moved, not as far as Koufax and Drysdale wanted, but it moved, and the men who would eventually move it further, the players who would negotiate the end of the reserve clause, who would fight for free agency, who would build the union that transformed the economics of professional baseball entirely, pointed to Koufax and Drysdale as the beginning. Not because they won everything, because they showed that winning something was possible, that the plan could work, that 2 men sitting in a room in January with a number and a lawyer and each other could make a system designed to ignore them pay attention. Koufax retired after the 1966 season. His elbow could not continue. He was 30 years old and one of the 3 or 4 greatest pitchers in baseball history, and he walked away because the alternative was permanent damage to an arm that had already given more than it had. He never returned. Drysdale pitched until 1969 and retired with 209 career wins. Both were inducted into the Hall of Fame. Both are remembered for what they did on the mound: the curveball, the sidearm delivery, the records, the World Series victories. But what they did in that Los Angeles room in January 1966 was also a kind of record. The first time 2 baseball players sat down together and said, "We are worth more than you are paying us, and we are going to prove it by refusing to be separated." The plan worked imperfectly. Most plans do. But the plan worked. And baseball was never entirely the same after it.